Hello everybody, the purpose of this video is basically to go over the foundation of communism and decide whether or not America is indeed practicing communism, or if nothing else, beginning to set down the framework of that to really occur. I mean, this really is coming from, we have the whole deal going on with Occupy Wall Street, and there's two lines of thought on that. And one is you have the side of it's wrong for 1% to own so much wealth. And many of the protesters believe this. I am not one of them, and the media doesn't represent the other side. And the other side is basically arguing that it's okay for the top 1% to own so much wealth. What's not okay is for them to be influencing the way that our political system works, and in addition to that, allowing for the wealth to be controlled completely by the government, and it being an endless cycle of corruption, which has pretty much happened. But that's what we're going to get into a little bit of arguing here. But I just wanted to present the facts here, and then I welcome any discussion about what's going on, and I apologize that this is a PowerPoint presentation, but unfortunately I'm not very familiar with how to edit these videos quite yet, although I plan on learning and hopefully providing better videos in the future. So let's get on with this. So we're going to go over Karl Marx's 10 planks to seize power, which essentially is the building blocks of communism, the foundation, whatever terms you want to use. He uses, in this case, planks. And I pretty much think that the direct translation here would be a foundation. What's necessary in order for communism to grow and really be successful, which arguably it can't be successful. I mean, we've attempted it in quite a few societies, and it always becomes corrupted, which I think is one of its flaws. Is just the basis on how communism works, which I can't really go over in this video because it's very lengthy, but basically I think communism fundamentally promotes corruption at the top, which really is the reason that it doesn't work. I think in a utopian society, communism would be great if everybody worked hard and worked together, but I just don't believe that it can be done on the scale that we would need it. If we're talking a small tribe, absolutely, but I don't think it's possible in a country of 300 million. So the first plank is the abolition of private property and the application of all rents of land to public purposes. I'm not going to read my lower part. It basically just gives you a little bit more facts about how America is implementing them. But essentially in this case, we haven't abolished private property completely. Clearly, you can still own a house. You can still own a condo, which is actually the air within the walls. But you do have application of rents of that land in property taxes. And if you don't pay your property taxes, the government can put a lien and take it. So you never truly own the property because you're constantly, in a sense, having to pay rent to the government. And if you stop paying that rent, they can take your entire property. So in a sense, this has already been happening. In addition to that, there is a lot of property that the government takes. There's a lot of area of desert that's taken by military installations that they decide that they just own, and in many cases they will buy it from the private citizen. So like I said, this one's not quite a very strong foundation point in America quite yet, but I think we are definitely heading in that direction. I think that's pretty much apparent just because of how it works. I mean, like I said, if you were to buy a property and then somehow you fell into a coma for 10 years and nobody took care of paying those property taxes, the government would take that property. So again, you don't really own it. You're paying rent. And if the government tomorrow decided to raise your property taxes, 100 times over, and you couldn't afford to pay those property taxes, the government could take your property. And not that that would necessarily happen, but by the same token, nobody thought there were going to be property taxes in the first place. So we're definitely heading in that direction. So again, this is a foundation block, maybe not the strongest, but it's clearly there. So the second plank is a heavy progressive or graduated income tax. This is basically meaning taxing the more wealthy more than you would tax the poor or the middle class for that matter. So essentially as to distribute the wealth, redistributing the wealth. This one is already in effect, although a lot of people would argue it's not because they hear things like, oh, well, Warren Buffett pays less in taxes than his secretary. That's not exactly a true statement. That is a corruption of the facts. He pays in dollars considerably more than his secretary. In addition to that, Warren Buffett doesn't take an actual income. He only takes capital gains. So it works a little differently because technically his income tax is essentially non-existent because he doesn't take an income. He only takes capital gains, which in a sense is your money making money. You're not the one making the money, if that makes sense. It's a little distorted, but at any rate, the Democrats typically want this in effect. This is one of their major platforms that they always stand on. They believe that if you can afford it, you should pay it, and those that can't afford it should basically get theirs. And again, it depends on how you look at it, but this one I think is a pretty solid building block at this point, because we definitely have, you pay more of a percentage as you earn more and more money. So I think this one's pretty clear. Okay, now the third one is the abolition of all rights of inheritance. Now this one, we clearly, again, this would be a very weak building block at the moment, but it's getting worse. And this would essentially be the inheritance tax. If your father made $10,000, well, let's say $10 million, and then he, God forbid, passed away, and you were to inherit that money, the government gets a portion of that, which makes no logical sense whatsoever. Part of that money ultimately goes to the government, and yet your father would have paid, in my scenario here, all his due taxes, paid everything forward. Had he lived, the money would still be his, but because he died, the government gets another piece of the pie here. Doesn't really make sense. Now in pure communism, you wouldn't get a penny. So again, this is a weaker building block. But you can already start to see, just, we've gone through 3 of these so far, and you can already start to see that America is definitely starting to have those communist undertones that I think really are killing the free market and killing our society as a whole. The fourth plank is confiscation of all property of all immigrants and rebels. This one's a kind of a difficult one to explain in a sense, but essentially it has to do with seizing property from those that either leave or rebel against the country, is how I understand it, which is kind of an odd one, but we can talk about how, I'm going to give you an example from my home state of Colorado. We actually have a law in the books that if the government, if a police officer pulls you over and believes you to be guilty of a crime and arrests you, and you go to the, to the jail for processing and all that stuff, and they tow your vehicle, even if you are proven innocent, even if it was a mistake that they thought, oh, you're a fat bald guy and that was who we were looking for, and they got the wrong guy, even if it was completely their fault, you still have to pay for getting your car out of impound. And that has to do with basically the rule of, I think they call it nuisance and abatement or something like that. But they're allowed to do this. It's ridiculous. And in that case, you didn't even do anything wrong. What they're talking about here is if you do something wrong, they can take your property. There's an interesting case about Gibson Guitar Company, which I urge you all to research, which basically Gibson had a lot of their materials taken from them by the government, despite having gone through all the proper paperwork for importing this, in this case, this wood that they were using for guitars from India. And ultimately, the government took that property, and the CEO still has not gotten his trial, probably won't for years. And meanwhile, his property's been seized, and he's having to try to conduct business without his product. So this is kind of another example of why we ship jobs overseas, because of too much government involvement. But anyway, that's kind of an example of this plank here. Okay, this is my favorite one. Centralization of credit in the hands of the state by means of a national bank with state capital and an exclusive monopoly. This one is so... I don't think there is a country on this planet that does it as well as we do. We completely circumvent our government even. We've taken this to the next level. Not only do we have a centralization of the bank with the Federal Reserve, but it's not even a government agency. It's a private agency that was given power by the government. And they answer essentially to nobody. I mean, they're supposed to answer to Congress. But if any of you have watched the chairman of the Federal Reserve being interviewed by right now Ron Paul is who's on the committee, trying to get answers out of this guy is impossible. You just can't get the information you need. Nobody really knows what's going on there. Nobody knows who's getting money from them, where the money's going, where it's being printed. They're manipulating the interest rates. This one is amazing that America hasn't. I mean, I can understand these other ones. America might think, well, it's not that big of an issue. I don't mind paying property taxes. I don't mind paying a graduated income tax. I can understand that to an extent. But this one, that the Federal Reserve is still around today, it's amazing. I mean, and people think that by increasing inflation that you're helping the poor and the middle class, which is it's the exact opposite, because that promotes the whole notion of it takes money to make money, and the people at the top are able to invest and save and collect the higher interest rates when they come out. And they make the money because they have the means to do so. And they take the majority of that inflation. And meanwhile, you don't get a raise immediately as inflation happens. You're always behind the curve. So, you're always a little behind. I could go on and on about the Federal Reserve. In fact, I'm probably going to end up making another video about the Federal Reserve specifically. But I just wanted to go over this with you guys. This one, I think, is critical for any communist society, is controlling the money, and they by far have that down. I mean, there's no question that the money is controlled by the Federal Reserve. Theoretically, tomorrow they could print, $10 quadrillion or whatever and distribute it to everybody and essentially reset the system and cause everybody to, be back to square one in terms of money. That level of power, and there's no real vote. I mean, you have just a couple of chairmen of the board, on the Federal Reserve, and they essentially make all those decisions for us. And there's no voting to, what do you do? You do have the one candidate, obviously, that wants to end the Fed, which is Ron Paul. But even if he were elected, I mean, how do you end this? I mean, is there really a way to end the Fed? Good question. Now, plank number 6 is centralization of the means of communication and transportation in the hands of the state. This one is basically just talking about, controlling the media, controlling transportation, that kind of thing. We do already have that to an extent through the FCC and the Department of Transportation, which each of you will have one in your respective states. This one's pretty ridiculous. It basically, I don't mind the Department of Transportation to an extent. I don't mind, paying for roads, which, we all use and things like that. I don't really have so much of an issue on that. But the FCC has really gotten involved to a massive extent. I mean, we can talk about the Super Bowl halftime where Jackson's nipple was exposed and all the fines and everything that were. I mean, it's a lot of control, and that's not even including the invisible control that we don't even see with corporations and media bias and all that stuff. We're just talking legitimate federal control here. Um, so yeah, I mean, we obviously have this. This is definitely a strong plank as far as our comparability. Is that a word? To communism. Okay, the seventh plank is extension of factories and instruments of production owned by the state, the bringing into cultivation of wastelands, and the improvement of the soil generally in accordance with a common plan. To be completely honest with you, I don't really fully understand this. Um, it sounds like what we do with a bunch of our agencies like land management, the National Park Services, the Bureau of Reclamation. Um, I think a lot of like the control on regulations maybe. I'm not entirely sure what this means, and I haven't read Karl Marx's manifesto in a very long time, and um, I'm not super familiar with this one, so I'd be happy if anybody wants to discuss this below. Um, I don't really understand this fully, but I do see kind of what they're talking about a little bit. I think it has to just do with essentially just making sure that the land keeps around, green energy kind of thing. Which, to be honest, I'm all for. I just think that we need to make it that the free market would have it more desirable if you stop subsidizing, gasoline and stuff. Gas prices go up, and if gas prices were up, you'd be more likely to get vehicles that have better gas mileage. And in fact, my first car, just really quick, my first car was a '94 Civic, and that car got about something like 35, 40 miles to the gallon. And this was, of course, before a lot of the regulations on safety, which, are good. I don't think it's good that they're regulated. I think it's good that they exist. I think that it would have existed anyway with the free market, but a lot of the regulations have caused cars to become heavier. You have to have cleaner emissions, things like that, which ultimately decreased fuel mileage. So anyhow, that's part of this. Number 8 is equal liability of all to labor, establishment of industrial armies, especially for agriculture. So to me, this sounds essentially like the minimum wage, which essentially makes us non-competitive on the world market. Um, Arguably, we would not have such a low. Okay, here's the problem. There's a lot of issues with this one. If we didn't have a minimum wage, I think that there would still be a free market minimum wage. There is a level that you would not accept a job. You're not going to take a job in America today for 20 cents an hour, especially with all the other options that you have with welfare and everything. There's no way you're going to take a job at 20 cents an hour. So the question is this high minimum wage, does it affect states like New York? Probably not quite so much because they have a higher standard of living. But does it affect, Nebraska, especially in rural areas? Absolutely. I think areas like that would be much better off if we did not have the minimum wage. In many cases, we work under the table for that reason. I think this is one of the issues that we have that people don't really understand. They think that the minimum wage is ultimately helpful because otherwise you would have the poor even poorer. And I think it actually has the opposite effect. In general, I don't really see the minimum wage helping anybody. You still can be well below the poverty line on minimum wage. It just doesn't really make sense. I think it's just another way to promote inflation, if anything else. The ninth pillar is combination of agriculture with manufacturing industries. gradual abolition of the distinction between town and country by a more equitable distribution of the population over the country. This essentially has to do with zoning, making it so that we don't have everybody in one area. I don't know if we really have this so much. Some of the examples, I guess, have to do with Planning Reorganization Act of 1949, some zoning laws and things like that, giving tax breaks to certain people in areas to move industries, things like that. Again, this is one of those that I don't fully understand, and I don't really see exactly what it means in the first place. So I'm going to kind of skip over this one. So this is the final one, which is free education for all children in government schools, abolition of children's factory labor in its present form, and combination of education with industrial production, etc. I mean, this one's pretty clear. The free education that we have public schools. The problem, there's a lot of problems with public schooling, as I'm sure many of you are aware, but it's essentially forced taxation in order to fund these schools, which many of us don't even feel are doing a adequate job. I know that if I have any children, I will do my damnedest to have enough money to send them to a private school, because public education is crap. It's, especially with Bush added No Child Left Behind, I believe it was Bush, complete chaos. The Department of Education is a joke. Too much bureaucracy, not enough focus on the actual children, teaching them. All this stuff, we have all these, I mean, it's amazing. Every day I hear something new on the news about, now they want to do gay education, like week or month, similar to like a Black History Month. I think that that's ridiculous to force kids to learn. I mean, why separate? Why separate everybody out? Why not just, American history? Like, why do we need to separate everybody in categories? It seems really dumb. And again, this has to do with government getting involved too much with schooling. Today's high school degree means nothing. A college degree today is what a high school degree meant 10 years ago, and it's a joke. I mean, it's a waste of time. I think that education is very important, but trade schools would be more useful, for as far as GDP growth goes. It just doesn't really make sense why we force this on people. The other part of this has to do with the abolition of child labor, essentially, which is a good thing. However, we do have a lot of regulations as far as there are 13-year-olds, 14-year-olds out there that want to get a summer job, part-time job, and can't because they are under the age in which you're allowed to work. And I don't see why that should be. I worked under the table when I was 14, hanging flyers on doors, and I don't see a problem with 14-year-olds continuing to do that. But again, that's government involvement, which always comes from a good reason, but a lot of times it's just very misguided. And I think that's pretty much it. So I don't know if you guys agree with me that America is becoming very communist, or whether or not that's even a bad thing. Many people would argue that it's a good thing. I am not one of those people. I think that this is terrible. I think that the Federal Reserve is probably our biggest problem currently. It caused this economic collapse that we're in. The fractional banking, and again, this is probably something that I'll have to go on another video with, but it created the bubble which everybody relied on, and it burst. And the people that really lost out were the lower end, the middle class and lower. The people that were really wealthy didn't really, miss out on much, and they pretty much got their wealth back because they were able to stay in the stock market and reinvest. And everybody else, they lost their houses, and tough cookies. And then the banks that lost money, they just got bailed out. So yeah, that's pretty much it. So Please leave any comments and questions below. If you really enjoyed this video, please subscribe to me, as I will be posting other videos in the future. And hopefully they will not be PowerPoint presentations, so I can stimulate your eyes as well as your ears. And thank you very much.